All right, before we start coding, I want to talk a little bit about HTML principles so that you can get an overview and really help you understand some basics before we start typing stuff. All right, so I'm going to give you a really quick brief history first of all to help you understand the framework in which HTML was invented. In the 1960s, there was a thing that was invented called ARPANET. ARPANET was funded by the US military, but it was primarily being researched in universities. And it was the first packet switching network using TCP/IP protocol, which we still use today, TCP/IP protocol, for doing networking. And it was a precursor to the World Wide Web. All right, and if you want to learn more, there's a link right here that you can follow. If you look at these pictures on the right, you'll notice that in 1969, which is kind of when it was first beginning, then in 1970, it went over to the East Coast, and then it grew a little bit more in 72. And you can see in 77, it was quite significant. And you can only just imagine now, you know, ARPANET is not ARPANET anymore. And that was back when computers used to look like this, all right? That thing on the right is a computer that probably I would be shocked if it can even do what your phone can do now. But and the big tape drives that are on the left are how they would store the media. And those tape drives, they can't even, you know, probably store what a USB thumb drive can store, which is pretty incredible. So let's talk a little bit about computers in the 70s and 80s. So they saw a really large increase of consumer and business personal style computers, like small computers, but most people still didn't have a simple way of connecting to one another. And this cute little picture on the right from 1976, that was the first Apple computer that was sold, believe it or not. And they used to put ads in these kind of computer magazines that people would read who were, you know, primarily interested in building computers and beginning of computer science and stuff. And if you continue further into the late 70s, early 80s, there was ARPANET, but it wasn't a large enough network for users to have a really common platform. And when I say users, people who use computers then, it was in the context of a large business, or it was typically people who were super into computers, like computer scientists. And there were in the middle, you know, sort of like the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, you know, some people would have things like the little apples, Apple IIe, things like that. But primarily it was people who were using it for business, usually. Oh, and by the way, if we go back one, you look at the cost of that 10 megabyte computer system, right? I don't know if you realize how small 10 megabytes is, right? Just think about it. When we're talking about these days, like gigabytes, terabytes, right? A megabyte is hardly any file size at all. In fact, the presentation that I'm going through right now is probably much larger than 10 megabytes. And it had an 8-bit processor. I mean, we're talking tiny stuff. And that thing was like $6,000, that plus a dot matrix printer. So it really gives you a sense. I mean, you could still spend $6,000 on a computer system today, but it really gives you a sense of how much things have changed and how fast technology moves. In 1990, the World Wide Web was conceived. This guy named Tim Berners-Lee created what we now know as the internet. He did propose it in written format in 1989, but it is accepted that it was invented in 1990. And this picture on the right, this was the very first server that was the first World Wide Web server. Okay, so let's talk about HTTP protocol. Tim Berners-Lee, in order to have an internet, right, he had to create this thing called the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You know, you guys might recognize that. A lot of times whenever you go up to type the URL in your web address for your browser, you don't have to type the http:// anymore, but that is referred to as, it's called the scheme, http://. That's a scheme. You can have other schemes up there like FTP, which is file transfer protocol. There are other protocols, but HTTP specifically is a web-based protocol. What it does is it goes out and it looks for another address that's on that network. This is what allows computers to deliver and receive web traffic. And on the right, this was just his initial idea. You can see how simple it is. Of course, now the concept of the cloud is incredibly complex, but this was the basic idea that he started with. And in fact, he originally drew it on the back of a napkin. And then to work with that, he had to also invent a language called HTML, and we're still using HTML today. I mean, of course, it's in a different version, but we are still using pretty much the same thing that the guy wrote back in 1990, but it's just, enhanced. And the language is called hypertext markup language. And there's the H, and then the T comes from the part text in the compound word hypertext, and then M from markup, L for language, right? And this is the underlying structure of all web documents still today. To view web documents, he also created the first web browser in 1990, which is on the right. And fascinatingly, to me, I mean, it really does still resemble pretty much the way that web browsers are today. It's pretty ugly, and the graphics are not great, and right, but that was a facet of the way that computers were more than anything else. But yeah, this is the first web browser. It was called the Next browser, which later became Netscape. So in the 90s, whenever the web kind of started growing up, there was an explosion of users because there was a standardized platform and language for communication now, and also technology, became a lot more affordable as manufacturers started coming up with tinier and tinier chips that were developed in Silicon Valley for processors, and more people were getting involved, so that also made it cheaper. And so if you fast forward a little bit to 1994, that was whenever the first e-commerce transaction actually took place. And once that happened, a lot of people started realizing, okay, we can use this for commercial uses. And Pizza Hut sold the first web purchase product through its transaction service. It was called NetMarket. I think it was a 21-year-old or 24 or something like that entrepreneur started. And this is what the site looked like. All right, that was the first site that sold something on the web. And then skipping a lot of years, as you can imagine, there were a lot of advances, a lot of commercial uses started popping up everywhere, especially it really increased whenever airlines started using it. By that time, it was sort of the Wild West out there in terms of the way that people marked up their websites whenever they wrote their HTML. And so it made it really hard for people who were disabled to use it, for instance, because there were no strict rules about how to write HTML, because it was a language that was so easy for a browser to interpret. Even when there were errors, it would still continue to load pages. And so people maybe who couldn't see, right, they couldn't use the web because screen readers didn't really exist. And whenever they finally did come out with them later, they weren't that great. And it made it really hard because people didn't write good code. And so in 2002, there was a thing called XHTML. It was still a version of HTML, but what it did was it basically tried to work with XML, or extensible markup language documents. So it forced a lot stricter standards. And what it also forced is this concept of markup being semantic and ADA accessible. And semantic markup basically, we'll get into it a little bit later when I show you some tag examples, but it means that the code that you write is, first of all, organized, and B, that it uses tags that are meaningful. All right, and we'll talk about how that looks later and what that means a little bit more. And then around 2004 to 7, it's whenever cell phones started getting used more and more for web traffic, because people wanted to use them as PDAs, these personal devices for business and stuff. And then it only made sense to also be able to use that as a phone too, and be able to search the internet all in one place. And people also were using, MP3 players and stuff. So people wanted to have their phone become the device that they could just have one thing in their pocket for, and it would do everything. And other brands like Nokia and Motorola, they started coming out with internet capable phones. They weren't that great. It wasn't until the first iPhone came out in 2007, that it really was a game changer. It was significant. So whenever that happened, people started using their phones for everything. The other thing that happened too is that people who lived in developing nations now had an affordable way to get on the internet and to be connected to the world in a different way with a cell phone, because it was now internet capable. And so people were using cell phones also as computers. And so it was extremely important that phones became way more usable as computing devices. So HTML5 came out sort of as an answer to XHTML, because XHTML, while it really helped standardize everything, it was so strict that it was also kind of complicated to write. And so there was a working group that kind of splintered off, and they called themselves HTML5, because prior to XML there was version HTML4, and then it went to XML. And then so this new working group said, let's make HTML5, and we're going to make it a little bit easier to write than XML. But now that people understand that they need to write by standards. And it also offered better integration with database material, semantic markup, JavaScript integration, and also better video capabilities. And so it just made better usability for those devices. That's kind of where we are today is with HTML5. There's so many devices now. There was just an explosion of all these different screen devices after the iPhone. And that also made HTML5 really important, and it made designers really rethink the standard way of writing and designing their code for the web, because this is also what happened, right? Is that things got really tiny on a watch, and then they got weird on a weirdly big or medium sized or whatever on a refrigerator or on whatever other strange device that you could think of that normally you wouldn't associate with the internet. And so now practically anything that is internet connected uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So universal design is really important. It's called universal design. It sort of goes even a step beyond accessibility design. Accessibility is specific for people who have disabilities, but universal design, it incorporates those concepts of designing for people with disabilities, but it moves a step further even and says, you know what, everybody should be able to access stuff in pretty much as many ways as possible. Meaning that if you have video, it should be captioned. Because even if you're not hearing impaired, maybe you want to be able, when you're in a meeting, to watch a video and have captions without the sound interrupting other things, so that you can be looking something up while you're trying to also contribute to the meeting. Maybe you've got a baby in one arm and you need to be able to use your phone with one hand, so you need easier form menu options that now come with HTML5. So there are lots of different things that HTML5 did to kind of help really promote universal design and better code-based design in general.